Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The Vanishing at Charnwood House. It began, as such things so often do, with a gathering of high society under the guise of charity. The great house of Charnwood, nestled among the gentle slopes of the Chiltern Hills, played host to a weekend party of elegant proportions. Its owner, the venerable Lord Adrian Dalbrook, was known not only for his vast estates and valuable art collection, but also for his generous patronage of the arts. The guests arrived in a flutter of feathers, silks, and whispered speculation, drawn to the promise of refinement, champagne, and perhaps a glimpse of scandal beneath the civility. It was on the second night of the affair, just after the velvet-draped dinner in the chandelier-lit hall, that the incident occurred. The weather had turned rather foul, and a dense fog clung to the grounds like a shroud. Guests had retired to the drawing-room, where firelight danced across the faces of titled men and painted women. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Conversation meandered like a lazy river, and yet, beneath it all, there was a tension, almost imperceptible, but present nonetheless. At precisely 9:30, the Earl's footman, a quiet and unremarkable young man named Charles Gregory, was asked to bring the family's prized bottle of Chateau Margaux from the cellar. He bowed, as was his way, and departed without a word. He never returned. At first, no one noticed. The Earl, distracted by a story told by the flamboyant Lady Willoughby, made a light joke about the pace of good wine and laughed off the delay. It was not until 10 o'clock that another footman was sent to fetch Charles. This footman, returning visibly shaken, declared that not only was Charles gone, but so was his livery, his belongings, and most mysteriously, the boots he had been wearing. By 11 o'clock, Lord Dalbrook had summoned the local constable. But there was no sign of forced entry, no indication of struggle, and certainly no evidence of theft. Nothing in the cellar had been touched. It was as though the young man had simply dissolved into the fog. The constable's investigation was brief and uninspired. He suggested that Charles Gregory had run off, perhaps with a woman, perhaps with some secret grievance. When it was pointed out that Charles had neither money nor family, nor any history of scandal, the constable shrugged in that peculiar British way, mumbled something about the unpredictability of youth, and left. But not everyone was so content. With that explanation, one of the guests at the house that weekend was a tall, slightly rotund gentleman with a waxed mustache, shoes that gleamed like obsidian, and a gaze that could unpick a man's soul. He had been invited as a friend of Lady Astwell, a widow of no small means, and a devoted admirer of clever minds. His presence was met with quiet curiosity, and a degree of awe by those who recognized him. His name, uttered with some reverence, by Lord Dalbrook himself when he took the gentleman aside the following morning, was Hercule Poirot. "Ah, monsieur," said Dalbrook in his study, his voice carefully modulated. "I dare say we might have a little mystery on our hands." Poirot gave a gentle nod. "A little mystery, yes. But such mysteries, my lord, often have the most curious resolutions." Lord Dalbrook leaned back in his leather armchair, regarding the detective with narrowed eyes. "Do you really think there is more to it than a simple desertion? A foolish young man, perhaps, easily tempted." Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There is always temptation, my lord. But the question is, to what purpose? A young man in service disappears. If he had merely run away, one must ask why he chose such a moment, such a method. He leaves behind no sign, no note, no trail. A most inefficient escape. That is not the act of a man in a hurry, but of someone who had help, or fear. Lord E. Dalbrook hesitated. You think foul play? Poirot's eyes sparkled. Ah, no. I think, my lord, that there is disorder where there should be symmetry, and that always offends me. At Poirot's request, the guests were discreetly asked to remain another night. He moved through Charnwood House like a quiet storm, his footsteps soft, his observations sharp. He examined the cellar and found the floor suspiciously clean. He visited Charles's quarters and noted a book left open to a page where a man declares his longing for escape. He asked to see the guest registry and spent long minutes tracing names with a fingertip. He was not alone in his efforts. Lady. Astwell followed him like a shadow, fascinated by his every move. You think one of us is involved, she said at one point, lowering her voice as they walked through the east corridor. I think, Poirot replied, that where there are people, there are secrets, and where there are secrets, there is the motive. By mid-afternoon, Poirot had conducted several brief but telling conversations with members of the household. Staff. Mrs. Tilling, the housekeeper, was flustered and forgetful. Strange, Poirot thought, for a woman with such military precision in her linen cupboards. The valet, a sour man with tight lips, seemed visibly nervous when Charles's name was mentioned. Then there were the guests. Lady Willoughby, flamboyant and sharp-tongued, insisted she had seen Charles shortly before he vanished. He was hovering near the music room, she said, as though waiting for someone. Though I suppose it's hardly unusual. These footmen are always flitting about, aren't they? Poirot had merely smiled and said nothing. Lord Dalbrook's daughter, Miss Imogen, had seemed vaguely disinterested when asked. I don't see why everyone is so agitated, she said with a graceful shrug. He was a servant, not a member of the family. Poirot's brow had furrowed slightly at that, but again he offered no opinion aloud. As night fell once more on Charnwood House, Poirot stood at a window overlooking the mist-soaked gardens. Hastings, who had arrived late at Poirot's invitation, stood beside him in silence. You've noticed something, haven't you? Hastings said at last. Poirot's moustache twitched. I have noticed, mon ami, that the smallest cog may stall the grandest of clocks. This young man, this Charles, he is that cog, and someone has gone to great lengths to remove him without noise. Hastings looked at him curiously. So what do we do? Poirot turned from the window, his voice low and calm. We apply the order. We observe the psychology. We peel back the varnish and see what lies beneath. And as the grandfather clock struck 10, echoing down the long hallways of Charnwood House, a cry rang out from the west wing. Something else had happened, and the puzzle had only just begun. Chapter 2. The gathering of suspects, the cry that rang. Out through Charnwood House was sharp, feminine, and unmistakably laced with alarm. Hastings, ever impetuous, sprang from his place beside the window and dashed toward the west wing. Poirot, more measured but no less concerned, followed at a brisk pace, his patent leather shoes tapping softly against the marble floors. They found the source of the commotion in one of the guest bedrooms. Lady Willoughby stood pale and breathless, one hand pressed to her lace-covered bosom, the other gripping the doorknob as if it might anchor her to sanity. He was in my room, she gasped. I swear it, he was there. Poirot stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Pardon, madame, who was in your room? She pointed toward the far end of the corridor. Charles Gregory, the footman, or someone dressed as him. I saw him standing by the wardrobe. I called out. He turned and bolted. Which direction? She gestured toward the servants' staircase. Hastings and two footmen who had arrived upon hearing the scream gave immediate chase, but Poirot merely walked into the room, his expression thoughtful. Lady Willoughby, trembling, allowed herself to be escorted to the drawing-room by Miss Imogen, who seemed more annoyed than alarmed. Poirot, alone now, moved to the wardrobe. It was ajar. He examined the interior carefully. No marks on the floor. No signs of entry or exit from within. The window, too, remained latched. He touched the doorknob, then walked to the rug and bent down, his fingertips brushing along the fringe. When Hastings returned moments later, breathless and empty-handed, Poirot straightened. "No sign of him," Hastings panted. "We searched all the way to the kitchens. Nothing." Poirot merely nodded. "That is to be expected." "You don't think she imagined it?" Poirot gave him a look. "Lady Willoughby is many things, Hastings, but prone to hallucination is not one of them. No, someone was in this room. Someone who wished to be seen, but only for a moment." "But why?" "That, mon ami, is the question. And to find the answer, we must begin with the people themselves. Assemble the guests. It is time we examined our little gathering more closely." Within the hour, the occupants of Charnwood House had convened in the drawing-room, summoned under the vague but effective pretense of clarifying certain details. Poirot stood by the fireplace, the dancing light casting long shadows across his composed features. Hastings stood slightly behind, notebook at the ready, though Poirot rarely required assistance in recalling the details he gathered. Lord Dalbrook opened the proceedings with a few dignified words about cooperation, but it was Poirot who commanded attention once he began to speak. "My friends," he said, his French-Belgian accent softening the gravity of his tone, "a man has disappeared. Another has now been seen, or believed to be seen, within the house, dressed in the uniform of that same man. There are no coincidences in such matters. I ask only for your patience and your truth. If we are to understand what has happened, we must know what each of you saw, heard, and thought, particularly in those hours before and after Charles Gregory vanished." He began with Lord Adrian Dalbrook, whose reputation for calm leadership made him the natural head of this eccentric party. "I saw very little," the Earl said. "Charles brought the wine list to me during dinner. I remember thinking he looked preoccupied, distracted perhaps. But then, young men often seem that way these days. You noticed no unusual behavior during the evening?" "No, other than his delay in returning from the cellar, which, as you know, ended in his complete disappearance." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, milord." Next was Lady Willoughby, her fan fluttering and voice trembling with dramatic tension. "He was in my room. I swear it. I didn't imagine it. I turned round to brush my hair and saw him in the mirror, standing still by the wardrobe, watching me." "And how was he dressed, madame?" "In his uniform. But, I don't know, something about him seemed different. He moved quickly. Too quickly. Did he speak? No. He fled the moment I turned." "Merci. And before last night, had you any particular interactions with Charles Gregory?" She sniffed. "He was polite, quiet, nothing more." Poirot made no comment, merely writing a short note in his little pocket diary. Miss Imogen Dalbrook was next. She was cool and collected, her every word carefully measured. "I barely spoke to the footman. I might have asked him to fetch my gloves at some point, but beyond that, I paid him no particular mind." "You noticed nothing unusual about his manner?" "No. He was forgettable." "Indeed," said Poirot, "and yet now he is unforgettable." She looked faintly annoyed by the remark. Then came Mr. Lawrence Dean, an artist with a flair for the melodramatic, invited by Miss Imogen. For reasons Poirot suspected went beyond art appreciation, Charles. "Strange chap, always skulking about. I thought him rather intense for a footman." "Did you speak with him?" "Once. He asked me about a painting I was working on. Odd question, though. Asked if I ever painted people who weren't there." Poirot's eyebrow twitched. "That is, as you say, odd." Dean shrugged, then flashed a grin. "Then again, artists attract the eccentric." Reverend Allerton, a quiet man with a habit of clasping his hands even when not in prayer, gave his account last. "I barely noticed the lad. He served at dinner, yes, but that is all. I did find it troubling, however, that someone might impersonate him. That suggests deliberate mischief. Perhaps even a cruel joke. Poirot gave a small smile. Indeed, though some jokes are not meant to amuse. As the interviews concluded, Poirot turned his attention to the staff. The housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling, and the valet, Mr. Cargill, were both reticent, but Poirot caught a flicker of something in their eyes when Charles's name came up, something like guilt or fear. "I shall speak with them more privately," Poirot murmured to Hastings as the drawing-room began to empty. "What do you make of it so far?" Hastings asked in a low voice. Poirot smiled thinly. "Each of them has told the truth, mon ami, but not all of it. Someone here is constructing a false picture, an illusion. You think they know what happened to the footman?" Poirot nodded. "Someone does. Perhaps more than one." That night, Poirot did not sleep. He wandered the halls of Charnwood House, not like a ghost, but like a watchman. He paused at the foot of the servants' staircase, tapped along the wainscoting, and examined a fireplace grate that seemed unusually clean. It was well past midnight when he returned to his room, and it was there, on his pillow, that he found something new. A white glove, carefully folded, and monogrammed with the initials CG. Poirot held it up, eyes glittering. Ah, the game continues. Chapter 3. Poirot arrives, in full force. Morning dawned at Charnwood House, with a cold, pale light and the scent of rain lingering in the air. Despite the grandeur of the estate, there was an unmistakable pall over the household, as though the fog had found its way indoors and settled in the corners of the rooms, cloaking everything in a sense of unease. The breakfast table was sparsely attended. Lord Dalbrook sat at the head, unread newspaper open before him. Miss Imogen stirred her tea without lifting her eyes from the cup, and Lady Willoughby fanned herself, claiming a restless night and a growing sense of being watched. Hercule Poirot, however, entered the room with his usual elegance, every button on his waistcoat gleaming, every hair in its place. He moved as if entirely untouched by the tension that gripped the others, yet there was a sharpness behind his gaze this morning, a quiet, razor-thin intensity. "Ah, bonjour, mes amis," he said, smoothly, seating himself beside Lord Dalbrook. "I trust you all slept sufficiently well?" There were muttered replies, a few polite nods. Lady Willoughby murmured, "I swear I heard someone moving in the corridor again last night. Footsteps." "Light, deliberate." Poirot smiled gently. "Oui, madame, that would have been me." This produced a small ripple of discomfort. Even Miss Imogen looked up briefly. Lord Dalbrook cleared his throat. "Monsieur Poirot, do you believe this situation to be of a more serious nature than it first appeared?" Poirot took a sip of his coffee. "I believe, my lord, that someone here is attempting to craft an illusion. A vanishing, yes, but not merely of a man, of truth, of motive." There was a silence at the table. Then Miss Imogen spoke, her tone measured. "It's beginning to feel like a performance." Poirot turned to her. "And like all performances, mademoiselle, it requires an audience, but also a curtain call. Before that comes, we must first observe every movement on the stage." Finishing his coffee, Poirot rose. "Now, if you please, I must speak with your housekeeper and your valet. There is a great deal they have not said." He found Mrs. Tilling, the housekeeper, in the linen room, folding napkins with the kind of precision that might have impressed a military quartermaster. She looked up nervously as he entered. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, with a small bob of her head. "I wasn't expecting—" "Non, madame. That is the point. Tell me, how long have you known Charles Gregory?" She blinked. "Only a year, sir. He came on from a smaller house in Oxfordshire. Good references, quiet sort. Always did what he was told." Did he have friends among the staff? Mrs. Tilling hesitated. Not especially. He kept to himself. But he was respectful. Did he ever confide in you? Another pause. Her hand stilled. Only once, a week ago. He asked if we kept records of visitors to the house. Poirot tilted his head. Visitors? Did he say why? He said he'd seen someone. Someone who didn't belong. Near the chapel wing. I told him he was mistaken. But he looked frightened. That wasn't like him. Poirot made a soft noise in his throat. And you said nothing to Lord Dalbrook? I didn't want to worry him unnecessarily. I thought Charles might have imagined it. Or it was one of the gardeners. Poirot gave her a long, level look. Merci, madame. You have helped more than you know. Next, he found Mr. Cargill, the valet, polishing cufflinks in the dressing room. The man was tight-lipped and cold-eyed, with the bearing of one who had grown bitter in service. I assume this isn't a social call, Cargill muttered as Poirot entered. Correct, monsieur. I require the truth. You and Charles Gregory, there. Was tension, none? Cargill said nothing at first. Then, he was too clever. That type's dangerous below stairs. Thinks he knows more than the rest of us. Asking questions, snooping. Snooping into what? Cargill glanced away. Some of Lord Dalbrook's business. Estate accounts. Old family rooms. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Old family rooms? There's a part of the house, near the chapel wing, that's mostly shut up. Been that way since the war. Charles. Had some notion he wasn't supposed to be there, but I caught him near it more than once. And what did you do? I warned him off. Told him if he kept poking around, he'd be sent packing. He just looked at me like I was part of the problem. Poirot gave a slow nod. Very well. That will be all for now, monsieur. By late afternoon, Poirot had gathered a thickening web of threads. A nervous housekeeper, a hostile valet, a vanished footman with a curiosity for hidden rooms, and a group of aristocratic guests who either knew too little or too much. He returned to his temporary quarters and sat down beside Hastings, who was nursing a cup of tea and a head full of questions. What do you make of all this? Hastings asked, clearly frustrated. We're no closer to finding the fellow. Non, mon ami, Poirot said gently, but we are closer to understanding what he found. He reached into his pocket and removed the glove, the one he had found on his pillow the night before. He unfolded it carefully and held it up to the light. What do you see, Hastings? Just a glove, said Hastings. White, monogrammed. Bit old-fashioned. Poirot turned it slightly. But it is the positioning that interests me. Folded precisely, not dropped, left. A message. A warning? Perhaps, or a breadcrumb. It says, look deeper. Someone is not what they seem. Hastings frowned. It's maddening. It's as if the footman wanted to be found and hidden at the same time. Precisely. At that moment there was a knock at the door. A young maid entered, pale and trembling. Begging your pardon, sir, she whispered. But the groundskeeper's dog just turned up something strange by the stone chapel. Poirot stood at once, already knowing, without yet knowing, that the next layer of the puzzle was about to unfold. Take us there, he said. Chapter 4. The First False Lead. The old stone chapel sat at the far edge of the estate, half consumed by ivy and time. It was a remnant of Charnwood's older lineage, unused since the death of Lady Dalbrook nearly 15 years before. Most guests assumed it was decorative, an atmospheric relic for strolls and sentimental photographs. But for Poirot, anything left to decay was ripe with possibility. The groundskeeper's dog, a sharp-eyed terrier named Jasper, had unearthed something half-buried beneath a patch of moss near the chapel's north wall. The maid who'd reported it hovered nearby as Poirot, Hastings, and Lord Dalbrook arrived, joined shortly by Mrs. Tilling and Mr. Cargill, each of whom seemed to have materialized with uncanny speed at the mention of the chapel. It wasn't a body, as Hastings half expected, but it was clothing, a footman's livery. Carefully folded, eerily dry despite the recent rain, and unmistakably belonging to Charles Gregory, Poirot crouched, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the garment. "You see, Hastings, this is not discarded. It is placed, as the glove was. But why take off his uniform?" Hastings murmured. "If he ran away, why leave it behind like a snake shedding its skin?" Poirot looked up, eyes narrowing. "Because a snake sheds its skin to become something else." Lord Dalbrook crouched beside him. "What in God's name is this meant to suggest?" Poirot stood, brushing off his knees. "My lord, it suggests not only that Charles Gregory wished to disappear, but that someone else wished to help him do so, or to appear that way." Mr. Cargill, standing stiff as a statue, muttered, "Could have changed into civilian clothes. Might be hiding somewhere nearby." Poirot turned to him. "Oui, monsieur. But then the question becomes, why vanish at all? A man may run from the law or from shame. But Charles Gregory had no debts, no criminal record, and no known family. What then is he running from, or what is he being hidden from?" Before Cargill could answer, the groundskeeper himself appeared, an elderly man with tobacco-stained hands and a gait like a listing ship. "Beg pardon, my lord," he said, tugging his cap, but Jasper sniffed up something else near the old tool shed. "Might want to take a look." They followed him in silence through the misty woods bordering the chapel. The tool shed stood crooked and weary, its wood softened by years of damp. Inside, Poirot paused, letting his eyes adjust. The space was cluttered, rakes, a wheelbarrow, old paint cans, but tucked into the far corner was something unexpected. A small satchel. Poirot opened it. Inside were a pair of muddy shoes, a clean white shirt, and a slim volume of poetry with a worn leather cover. The name C. Gregory was etched in small letters on the inside page. Hastings frowned. "Doesn't look like he planned to go far. If he's hiding, he didn't bring much with him." Poirot examined the shoes. "Size too large. Then they're not his, or meant not to appear his," Poirot murmured. There was a strange silence, broken only by the creak of the wind through the trees. Poirot looked around the shed slowly, methodically, then up at the low wooden beams overhead. Something glinted. "Ah," he said quietly. With Hastings steadying the ladder, Poirot ascended and retrieved the object from the upper shelf. It was a watch, silver, slim, with a delicate chain. Etched into its back were the initials LD. "Lord Dalbrook," Hastings whispered. Poirot didn't respond. He turned the watch over, noting the faint smear of something reddish-brown on its edge. They returned to the house in silence. Poirot did not speak until he had washed his hands and placed the watch into a sealed envelope. That afternoon, he requested the presence of Lord Dalbrook in the library. The Earl entered, looking composed, but strained. "Poirot, I've just spoken with the constable again. He insists there's no crime unless a body is found." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "The provincial mind is often limited, my lord. Permit me to ask you a delicate question." Lord Dalbrook inclined his head. "Go on." "This watch." Poirot placed the envelope on the table, unopened. Was found in the tool shed, a shed near where Charles Gregory's uniform was hidden. I believe it belongs to you." The Earl's expression froze. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes. It was a gift from my late wife. I thought it lost. Months ago. Did you ever see Charles Gregory handling it?" "No, but I suppose he may have found it and put it aside. Perhaps he was going to return it and never did." Poirot leaned forward. "Or perhaps he found it where it should not have been, and someone noticed." Dalbrook's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something, monsieur?" "No. My lord, I accuse no one. I merely collect— what is the English phrase? The pieces of the jigsaw. There was a pause. Dalbrook stood abruptly. Let me be clear, Poirot. I am cooperating because I wish for this matter to be resolved. But I will not have my reputation smeared by insinuation. Poirot nodded with utmost civility. Of course, my lord. When the Earl left, Hastings turned to Poirot, barely containing himself. Surely that's it. Dalbrook. He must have had some quarrel with the footman. Maybe Charles found something he shouldn't have. The watch, the livery, the whole setup, it all points to him. Poirot shook his head slowly. No, mon ami. Lord Dalbrook is proud, stubborn, and flawed, yes. But a man like that does not hide his shame in a tool shed. Then who? Poirot steepled his fingers. That is the question. You see, we have arrived at the first of our false leads. It is too early, too neat. The watch, the uniform, it is a composition. But the brushstrokes are too bold. Someone wants us to suspect Lord Dalbrook. Hastings stared. You think someone is framing him? Poirot gave a small, elegant nod. And therein lies the true mystery. Not who vanished, but who wanted the disappearance to cast such a long shadow. That evening, the guests were unusually subdued. Dinner was a quiet affair, and many retired early. But Poirot remained in the drawing room, gazing thoughtfully into the fire. He knew now that the answers lay not in the chapel or the shed, but in the minds of those present. One among them was a master of illusion, setting the stage, planting the evidence, manipulating perceptions, and Poirot would not play their game. He would rewrite the rules. As the grandfather clock struck 11, Poirot rose at last. Hastings, he said softly, tomorrow we begin the real work. We will question not only the facts, but the souls behind them. And with that, he turned in, the sound of the ticking clock trailing behind him like the beat of an unseen drum. Chapter 5. The Psychological Game. The next morning brought no new cries, no fresh discoveries by curious dogs, no uniforms draped in impossible places. Yet in the stillness of Charnwood House, Hercule Poirot sensed a storm beginning to gather, not in the skies above, but in the minds of those under its roof. It was not evidence he sought now, but vulnerability. The kind that revealed itself not through alibis or timelines, but through an involuntary glance, a word uttered 1 second too late, or a truth clumsily buried beneath civility. The drawing room had become his stage. He arranged it with intent. 3 armchairs, each facing slightly toward the hearth, a small table laid with fresh tea, and a notepad that he would never use but whose presence created the illusion of formality. The guests were invited one by one, not summoned, never that. Poirot knew that a mind under pressure yielded more when it believed itself in control. Lady Willoughby entered first, a vision in lavender silk and anxious fanning. She perched on the edge of her chair like a bird prepared to flee. "Ah, madame," Poirot said warmly. "You grace the room like spring." She gave a strained laugh. "You flatter, Monsieur Poirot, though I must admit I could use some levity. This house feels cursed." "Cursed, madame?" "That is a strong word." She lowered her voice. "Oh, you must feel it too. The dread. The way the staff look at you as though everyone's harboring some dreadful secret. And that poor boy, gone, like smoke." Poirot nodded slowly. "You were the last person to see him, or someone dressed as him. Tell me, Lady Willoughby, have you ever encountered something uncanny?" Her eyes widened. "You mean ghosts?" Non, not the supernatural, the uncanny in people. That moment when you realize someone is not who they claim to be." She paused. Then, "Yes, once, in Florence. A man I knew as a banker turned out to be a thief. Very charming, disarming even. He never raised suspicion until the day he vanished with 3 paintings and a small fortune." Poirot leaned forward, slightly. And what gave him away? She blinked. His shoes. They were always too worn for a banker. Poirot's eyes glittered. Just so. When she had gone, Poirot scribbled a single word in his private notebook. Perceptive. Next came Mr. Lawrence Dean, the artist. He sauntered in with a faint smile, hands in pockets, demeanor casual to the point of carelessness. You're interrogating. Us all, then. Non, monsieur. I am merely speaking. You may think of it as portraiture. I seek not the face, but the expression beneath. Dean chuckled. You sound like a fellow artist. Perhaps. Tell me, what do you think happened? To Charles Gregory? Dean's brows lifted. Honestly, he's probably lying low in some village, laughing at all this fuss. Maybe he found love. Maybe he stole something. Poirot studied him. Do you believe that? Dean hesitated. I believe people are unpredictable, especially the quiet ones. You spoke with him once, about painting things that are not there. Dean's gaze flickered. Did I? I may have. I often speak in metaphors. You mustn't take me too literally, monsieur. But people who vanish are quite literal, no? They must go somewhere. Dean smiled, but his fingers tapped against the chair's arm, a nervous rhythm. Poirot watched them, then gently asked, Have you ever painted someone you did not know? Frequently. That's half the thrill. And do they ever look back at you from the canvas, monsieur? The tapping stopped. Dean's smile faded just a touch. Only if I've done it? Right. Poirot let that silence settle before dismissing him with a nod. As Dean left, Poirot noted Hyde's tension in playfulness. The third guest was Reverend Allerton, who arrived holding a small, leather-bound prayer book and wore an expression of permanent solemnity. He sat with both hands clasped, fingers interlocked, tightly. I suppose you have questions, Monsieur Poirot. Only one to begin with, Monsieur le Pasteur. What does your conscience tell you? Allerton blinked. My conscience? Poirot nodded. It is often the most honest witness. The Reverend seemed momentarily thrown. My conscience tells me that something is terribly wrong in this house. In what way? In the way people look away when asked direct questions. In the silences at dinner. In the way the staff are frightened to speak openly. Are you frightened, monsieur? I am concerned. Charles was a good servant. He listened. Perhaps too well. Poirot tilted his head. And what would he have overheard that might make him disappear? Allerton hesitated. That I do not know. But I believe his disappearance is not a random act, nor a crime of passion. It is cold, intentional. Poirot steepled his fingers. Merci, monsieur. One last thing. Have you ever known a lie to be spoken with kindness? The Reverend hesitated. Yes, but it does not make it less of a lie. Poirot scribbled again, moral clarity, but guarded. After the interviews, Poirot rejoined Hastings, in the conservatory where the windows overlooked the fog-covered grounds. Well? Hastings asked. Find anything useful? Poirot nodded. Mais oui. Every answer today was like a chess move. Calculated, measured, defensive. But nothing concrete. Concrete is for the police. I require something subtler. He withdrew from his pocket the white glove again, the one left on his pillow. I left this deliberately on the mantelpiece during each conversation. Only one guest noticed it. Lady Willoughby? Poirot smiled. Mais non. Reverend Allerton. He looked at it twice but said nothing. Hastings frowned. And that means something? It means that someone who preaches honesty is avoiding a symbol of concealment. Fascinating. Hastings gave a groan. You're impossible, Poirot. You find suspicion in silence. And where better to hide guilt, mon? Ami, there was a knock at the conservatory door. Mrs. Tilling entered, pale and tense. I'm sorry to disturb you, but the young maid, Annie, she's disappeared. Hastings leapt up. What? Another disappearance. Poirot's expression did not change, but a storm gathered behind his eyes. No, Hastings, not a disappearance, an escalation. Where was she last seen? In the West Wing, Mrs. Tilling said. She was asked to light the fire in the blue sitting room. That was nearly 2 hours ago. Poirot stood. We go now. They searched the wing carefully, Poirot, Hastings, and the increasingly pale Mrs. Tilling. In the blue sitting room, the fire was burning low. The grate was clean, the logs half consumed, and on the floor, just near the hearth, lay a torn scrap of white lace. Poirot bent, picked it up delicately, and examined the fabric. His fingers pinched the thread. Not from the maid's uniform, he murmured. This belongs to someone else. He turned to Hastings. We are not being outwitted. Mon ami, we are being watched. The game is no longer about hiding what happened to Charles Gregory. Then what is it about? Poirot straightened, his voice low and sharp. It is about control, and whoever is playing this game, they are raising the stakes. Chapter 6. Another crime or major reveal. Annie Cooper, the missing maid, was found just past dawn. It was the gardener who spotted her. A small, crumpled figure huddled behind a hedge bordering the eastern orchard, her apron damp with dew and streaked with ash. She was alive, but shivering, her eyes wide with fear and unresponsive to questions. She could walk, barely, but offered no account of where she had been or what had happened to her. She clutched a handkerchief in her fist, white, embroidered with a small faded W, but said nothing of its origin. By the time Poirot arrived, summoned before the dew had even lifted, she had been moved inside to the warmth of the servants' hall. Mrs. Tilling was fussing over her with blankets and tea, but Annie merely stared blankly at the wall, as if her mind had retreated from whatever it had seen. Poirot's gaze flicked from the girl to the handkerchief. With a nod to Mrs. Tilling, he stepped forward and spoke softly in French, a soothing murmur rather than interrogation. He had used it before on shell-shocked soldiers and children caught in the debris of war. Sometimes language, foreign to the trauma, could part the veil. Annie blinked slowly. Her grip on the handkerchief loosened. Poirot took it gently and examined it. Fine cotton, neatly hemmed, with an almost imperceptible trace of lavender scent. He folded it and placed it in his pocket. She has seen something, he murmured. To Mrs. Tilling. But she is not yet ready to speak it. The house was in uproar. Rumors spread like ink in water. Annie had seen the ghost of Charles Gregory. She had been attacked by an intruder. She had discovered a secret passage. Even Lady Willoughby, usually the queen of speculation, looked shaken rather than smug. At breakfast, the gathering was somber. No one touched the eggs. The clink of silverware echoed in the silence. Poirot, seated beside Hastings, addressed them gently. Mademoiselle Annie has been found. She is physically unharmed, but mentally troubled. It is my belief that her fright is genuine and not theatrical. Lord Dalbrook's jaw was tight. You're saying someone in this house tried to harm her? I say nothing. Yet. But the timing is curious, Non. A maid disappears the same day I begin asking questions. Serious questions. Someone, I think, wished to send a message. Miss Imogen looked up sharply. A message to whom? To me. This sent a ripple around the table. Poirot continued. We must ask, who benefits from confusion? Who grows stronger when others are afraid? It was Reverend Allerton who spoke next, quietly. Someone who relies on illusion, misdirection. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Just so. A magician, perhaps, but this magician has made one mistake. He rose from his chair, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Charles Gregory did not vanish alone. He took with him a truth, one so dangerous that someone here has now twice tried to bury it. First with his disappearance, then with fear. But truth, mes amis, does not stay buried. It leaves traces, scraps of lace, a glove, a watch. Lady Willoughby paled at the word watch, and Poirot did not miss it. After breakfast, Poirot returned to the chapel with Hastings in tow. The mist was lifting now, the light less grey, but the atmosphere remained heavy. "You believe the answer lies here?" Hastings asked as they approached. Poirot did not answer. Instead, he moved to the rear wall of the chapel and knelt, his gloved hands brushing along the base of the stone. Then he stood and began tapping the wall in a steady rhythm, his ear pressed close. "There," he said finally, stopping at an uneven flagstone near the base of the rear pulpit. Hastings watched as Poirot retrieved a small blade from his coat pocket, never carried for defense, only for careful inspection, and worked at the edge of the stone. With a faint groan, the tile lifted, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound notebook. Poirot drew it out with reverence. "What is it?" Hastings asked. Poirot opened it and scanned the pages, his eyes flickering, brow furrowing. "It is Charles Gregory's journal." The handwriting was tidy, almost compulsively neat, and it was not the diary of a servant. It was the journal of an observer, perhaps even a witness. Charles had recorded names, conversations, times, mentions of things that don't add up, repeated references to the chapel wing, the missing portrait, and the west stair cupboard. Most damning of all was an entry dated 5 days before his disappearance. "Saw her again last night, slipping out of the drawing room with the letter in her hand. She doesn't know I noticed. Must find where she hides them." "Who is she?" Hastings asked. Poirot turned. The page. No name followed. But further down, one phrase stood alone. W, monogrammed. "Hidden guilt. Knows I know." Hastings blinked. W. Lady Willoughby. Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he closed the journal with great care. We must speak with her. But delicately. They returned to the house just past midday. Lady Willoughby, when summoned, arrived wrapped in a fur stole far too grand for the hour, and with rouge applied in a hand slightly less steady than usual. Poirot gestured to the seat before him. "Madame? There is no accusation, only curiosity. You knew Charles Gregory better than you let on, did you not?" She laughed, but it was hollow. "A servant, monsieur. I barely noticed him. Yet he noticed you, and he wrote of you. About the letter." Her eyes froze. "What letter?" Poirot said nothing. Instead, he opened a drawer and removed a letter from within, a letter not from the journal, but another, recently retrieved from Charles's quarters. Unsigned, unaddressed, but written in a hand Poirot recognized from Lady Willoughby's signed thank-you notes to Lord Dalbrook. She went still. For a moment she seemed to sag inward. "Yes," she whispered at last. "I wrote it. It wasn't what you think. He had information. I needed it. I asked him to return something that belonged to me." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Return? What, madame?" She hesitated. "Letters, old ones, from someone I once knew. I thought they were destroyed, but Charles found them in the cellar." "And he threatened you?" "No. He never asked for money. He only said he'd found them, and knew they were personal. I asked for them back, I begged, but he seemed unsure. He said he'd decide what to do. And then he vanished." She looked up sharply. "I didn't harm him, I swear it. But I was afraid. Afraid he'd show someone, that my past would be dragged into the light." Poirot was quiet for a long moment. "You are not the first to make such a bargain, madame, nor the last. But secrets are like debts. They do not disappear when ignored." When Lady Willoughby had gone, Hastings turned to Poirot. "So that's it. She's the key." Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. She is a thread, but not the knot. He turned again to the final pages of the journal. There, between the lines, was one final entry, written in a hand more hurried than the others, and this one named a place. I heard it again. The cupboard at the top of the west stairs, something inside it, scratching, whispering, like a voice from behind the wall. Poirot looked up. We go there. Now. Chapter 7. Poirot's Hidden Clue. The west stairs of Charnwood House were seldom used. Unlike the grand central staircase that curved elegantly from the main hall, these were narrow, uncarpeted, and creaked under the weight of a single step. Originally designed for servants' use in the older days of the estate, they now offered a quiet, shadowy ascent into a part of the house that had long since fallen into disuse, a wing forgotten, or perhaps avoided. Poirot climbed with measured steps, Hastings at his side, the journal still clutched in the detective's hand like a map. At the top of the staircase was a narrow landing, and just as the journal described, a squat cupboard built into the wall, ordinary in appearance, dust-laced and unremarkable. Yet it hummed, somehow, with a quiet anticipation, as though it had waited for this moment to be noticed. Poirot crouched and ran his gloved fingers along the edges of the cupboard. You see, Hastings, what appears mundane is often the most vital. This cupboard was described not by a poet or a dreamer, but by a man who saw too much. He heard something here, something real. Hastings peered over his shoulder. You think someone's been hiding in it? Poirot smiled faintly. No, but something was hidden within it, and perhaps still is. He opened the cupboard door. It creaked. Inside, shelves bore only the remains of old polish tins, a broken candle holder, and what looked like an abandoned rag. But Poirot did not reach for these. Instead, he examined the rear panel with laser focus. Observe. The wood here is not original, newer by at least 10 years, and thinner. He took the small blade from his pocket once more and pressed against the panel's edge. A soft crack, a breath of dust, and the panel gave way. Behind it was a hollow space no more than 6 inches deep. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine, was a bundle. Poirot carefully removed it and unwrapped the cloth. Within were several items. A slim envelope, yellowed with age. A woman's brooch, faded but bearing the crest of a minor French noble family. And a key, ornate, old-fashioned, and heavy. Bon, Poirot said softly. Now we begin to understand, he examined the envelope first. It was addressed in a feminine hand to Antoine. Desmarais, COO Lord Adrian Dalbrook, Charnwood House. The postmark was dated 18 years ago. Hastings frowned. Antoine Desmarais. That's not a name I've heard among the guests. Poirot nodded. It is not the name of a guest. It is the name of a ghost. He turned over the letter but did not open it. Instead, he turned to the brooch, carefully lifting it between his fingers. This emblem, see? A baronial fleur-de-lis interwoven with the letters D and C. Dalbrook. And Chanteloup, Poirot said. A small family line from the Loire Valley. I recall the name from a case years ago. An elopement that ended in scandal. The young woman vanished. The family covered it up. You think this Desmarais is connected to them? Poirot's face was thoughtful. I think Charles Gregory was not always Charles Gregory. He placed the objects down and took up the key, weighing it in his palm. And this, Hastings, this opens something older than truth, or at least older than the version we have been told. Back in Poirot's room, the fire crackled quietly, while Hastings pored over a county registry book retrieved from Lord Dalbrook's private library. Poirot, meanwhile, began constructing a timeline: births, deaths, arrivals, departures, tracing every resident and guest of Charnwood House over the last 20 years. At last, Hastings spoke. I found him. Antoine Desmarais. Born 1903 in Lyon, educated in England, came to Charnwood House as a junior secretary to Lord Dalbrook's father around 1925. Poirot nodded. And dismissed quietly in 1926. No reason given. Nothing. In the news. No scandal. It's like he disappeared. No, Hastings. He was erased. Poirot turned back to the journal. Charles Gregory was too intelligent for a footman, too discreet, too observant. I believe he discovered a connection between himself and this house. Perhaps he knew already, perhaps he suspected. But he found evidence, letters, tokens, and he began to understand that he was not merely a servant, but something else. Hastings leaned in. You're saying Charles Gregory was really Antoine Desmarais' son? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Oui, a child born of scandal, hidden away, perhaps adopted. And perhaps, one day, he returned to the place his mother once lived, unknowingly or by design, and he uncovered the truth, or enough of it to frighten someone. They were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Miss Imogen, looking unusually tense. Monsieur Poirot, might I speak with you privately? Of course, mademoiselle. She entered and sat, hands clasped tightly. There's something I haven't told you, she said. About Charles. Go on. A few days before he vanished, he came to me in the library. He said he'd discovered something about my mother. Your mother? Yes. She died when I was young. At least, that's what I've always believed. But he hinted that it might not be true, that she left, that it was covered up. Poirot was silent for a moment. Then, did he mention a name? She shook her head. Only that he'd found a letter hidden in one of the cellar beams. He said he needed time to verify it. I didn't believe him. I thought he was confused, or worse, blackmailing me. And did he show you this letter? No. And then he disappeared. Poirot nodded slowly. Mademoiselle, I believe the man you knew as Charles Gregory may have been your half-brother. She stared at him, eyes wide. That's not possible. Ah, but it is. And that possibility is the key. He may have uncovered a lineage someone wished forgotten. He may have discovered that his life was a shadow of a different name. He rose and paced. And if I am correct, then someone here is protecting more than their reputation. They are protecting a lie. One that began nearly 2 decades ago. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Tilling entered, breathless. Monsieur Poirot, the maid, Annie. She's speaking again. She asked for you. Poirot hurried down to the servants' quarters, where Annie sat propped against a cushion, her skin pale, but her eyes lucid now. She trembled when he entered, but nodded as he approached. You are safe, mademoiselle, he said gently. No, one will harm you here. Her voice came out in a whisper. He didn't run away. Who? Charles. He didn't run. I saw someone pulling him into the chapel. Poirot's breath caught. When? The night he vanished. Just after dinner. I was fetching kindling and saw them. Just shadows. But one had his uniform. The other wore black gloves. Could you tell who it was? She shook her head. Only that it wasn't a servant. Poirot placed a hand over hers. You have done well, mademoiselle. Rest now. As he left the room, Poirot's expression had changed. What is it? Hastings asked. Poirot's voice was low. The gloves, the chapel, the deception. Someone lured Charles there, knowing what he had found. They feared exposure, not for a crime of passion, but for a lie woven through years of silence. Then what now? Poirot's eyes glittered. Now, mon ami, we gather everyone. The players must return to the stage. The final act begins. Chapter 8. The Final Gathering. By the time dusk folded its arms across the lawns of Charnwood House, Hercule Poirot had already set his pieces in motion. A note was discreetly slipped beneath each bedroom door, an invitation, though its tone brooked no refusal. The drawing room, 9 o'clock, no exceptions. Even Lord Dalbrook received his with a raised brow and a murmured, "So it begins." Poirot did not dine with the guests that evening. He took only tea and a light biscuit in his room, preferring the company of his thoughts. When the grandfather clock in the hall chimed once for the half-hour, he rose, adjusted his cravat with immaculate care, and descended. The drawing-room had been subtly arranged. Chairs were set in a loose semicircle facing the hearth. The lighting was low but deliberate, lamps trimmed to cast just enough glow for expressions to be clearly seen, yet soft enough to feel confidential. A faint scent of sandalwood lingered in the air, barely perceptible but calming. And on the mantel, as though by accident, rested the folded white glove and the monogrammed handkerchief retrieved from Annie. The guests arrived in ones and twos. Lady Willoughby first, swathed in maroon, her perfume strong as a defense. Then Reverend Allerton, solemn, holding a Bible as if he feared he might need divine intercession before the night was over. Mr. Lawrence Dean followed, lounging into his seat with the detachment of a man who pretended to find everything amusing. Miss Imogen Dalbrook entered quietly, eyes flicking about the room, lingering only briefly on Poirot before she chose the chair farthest from the fire. Lord Dalbrook was last, his cane clicking with dignified rhythm, expression unreadable. Poirot waited until the room had settled into a hush. Only the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel broke the silence. Then he stepped forward. "Mesdames." "Et monsieur," he began, voice gentle yet commanding. "Thank you for coming. What I am about to say may unsettle you, but the truth, she is often inconvenient. Still, she is necessary." He turned to the fire, then slowly back to the circle. "1 week ago, Charles Gregory, footman to Charnwood House, disappeared. That much we know. What has been less clear is why. For many of you, he was invisible. A uniform. A yes, sir. A thank you, ma'am. But Charles Gregory was more than a servant. He was a man seeking the truth." Lady Willoughby stirred in her seat. Poirot continued. "He was not born Charles Gregory. His real name, we believe, was Charles Desmarais, the son of Antoine Desmarais, a man once employed here in the service of Lord Dalbrook's father. His mother, a Frenchwoman of some distinction, vanished under quiet scandal. The connection was erased. But blood, mes amis, does not forget." A shocked silence. Miss Imogen's voice broke through it. "That's not possible." Poirot turned to her. "And yet it is. Mademoiselle Charles found a letter hidden in the cellar, written by your mother. A letter addressed to Antoine Desmarais. He discovered the truth, and he was determined to trace it to its end." Poirot moved to the mantel and picked up the glove. "This was placed upon my pillow. A warning. Or perhaps a breadcrumb. Charles left clues, deliberate, clever. He did not trust everyone, but he knew someone would find what he could not say aloud." He replaced the glove and stepped closer to the guests. But Charles was not the only one hiding something. Many in this room carry secrets. He turned to Lady Willoughby. "You, madame, wrote to Charles under the guise of a retrieval. But you feared exposure," she stiffened. "That does not make me a killer." "No," Poirot said gently. "But it makes you vulnerable, and someone used that fear." Next, his gaze swept to Lawrence Dean. "You dismissed Charles, called him intense, but he approached you because he believed art hides truth in plain sight. You, monsieur, spoke with him often, but you underestimated him." Dean raised a hand. "You think I'm behind all this? That I spirited him away for knowing about brooches and family skeletons?" Poirot gave a small shrug. "No, monsieur. You are a man who enjoys secrets too much to act upon them." Poirot turned, now facing Reverend Allerton. You saw the glove. You noticed it twice, yet you never asked about it. Why? Allerton fumbled. I thought it best not to interfere. I didn't want to involve myself further. A man of the cloth who avoids a sign of guilt? Poirot shook his head. Non, monsieur. You feared the implications. But your fear was of knowledge, not of action. Poirot allowed the silence to build, every eye upon him. Then at last, he turned to Lord Dalbrook. My lord, you claimed your watch was lost months ago, and yet it was found in a shed that only you and a few long-serving staff would have reason to visit. Did you not wonder how it got there? Dalbrook did not answer. Poirot stepped forward. Your late wife did not die of illness. She fled this house, did she not? After discovering the affair between your father and the Frenchwoman. A murmur rippled through the room. She left shamed and took her daughter, Miss Imogen, with her. You reconstructed the truth in the name of dignity, but your father left traces. Desmarais, exiled quietly, and a child, born later in France. Hidden. That child grew up, came here, and began to ask questions. Miss Imogen was pale now. Charles was my brother. Poirot looked at her with genuine softness. Yes, mademoiselle, he did not wish to disrupt your life, but he could not ignore what he had discovered, and someone feared what he might reveal. Poirot turned now, fully, to the last chair. But the person who acted, the one who lured Charles to the chapel, was not Lord Dalbrook. It was someone else, someone who had the most to lose from a truth emerging. He stepped forward slowly. Mrs. Tilling, he said. The housekeeper stood just inside the doorway, unseen until that moment by most. She froze, her face suddenly bloodless. No, she said. Poirot's voice remained calm. Yes, madame. You knew the truth. You were here when Desmarais was dismissed. You kept the letters, the brooch. You took them for safekeeping, or for leverage. And when Charles began to pry, he came to you. He turned to the guests. But she did not act at first. No. Mrs. Tilling watched, waited. Then, when Charles approached Miss Imogen, she panicked. She feared the scandal would return, that everything she had protected would unravel. Mrs. Tilling shook her head slowly. I didn't mean to hurt him. I only meant to frighten him. I thought if I led him to the chapel, told him to stop asking questions, he would listen. Poirot's voice softened. But he resisted, didn't he? She nodded, eyes glassy. He said he deserved to know the truth, that it was his birthright. And so you pushed, Poirot said gently now. A struggle. An accident. But instead of reporting it, you hid him, hid the truth again. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I buried the journal, hid the uniform. I thought if I made it look like he'd run off, no one would question it. But then Annie saw. She saw me coming back. Poirot stepped forward and took her hand. It is over, madame. Let the truth rest now. The silence that followed was absolute. Not one of the guests spoke. Poirot turned and looked once more at the fire, his face composed but solemn. I will inform the authorities, he said at last. But know this. Truth, like water, finds its way through stone. Even the most carefully built wall cannot hold it forever. And with that, the great Belgian detective, master of psychological deduction and moral clarity, walked from the drawing room, leaving behind not only a mystery solved, but a legacy reclaimed. Chapter 9. The reveal, the confession, though quiet and soaked in regret, fell over the guests like a sudden snowfall, suffocating, silencing, and oddly beautiful in its finality. Mrs. Tilling had spoken no further word after Poirot's pronouncement. She had not pleaded nor wept dramatically. She had merely stood as one who had carried a burden too long, and finally set it down. In that stillness, no one dared speak. No one moved to comfort her. Poirot allowed the silence its weight. He knew it was necessary. Guilt, once named, had a peculiar echo. It rang not only through the guilty, but across all who had touched the lie, even unknowingly. Later that evening, as the sky bruised into midnight and the first tentative drops of rain ticked against the tall windows, Poirot convened only a small company in the library, those who had been most entwined in the mystery: Lord Dalbrook, Miss Imogen, Lady Willoughby, Reverend Allerton, and Hastings. Mrs. Tilling, under the soft escort of the local constable, had already departed for the village station. No handcuffs, no spectacle. Poirot had ensured that. "My friends," Poirot began, as the library door clicked closed behind them, "though the culprit has confessed, there are still truths which must be spoken plainly. You deserve to understand the entire tapestry, not only the final knot." He moved to the hearth and placed the Desmarais journal upon the mantel, beside the glove, the handkerchief, and the key. What began as the disappearance of a footman was, in truth, the reawakening of a long-suppressed history, one which touched you all, whether you realized it or not. He turned to Lord Dalbrook, whose brow was furrowed with shame and uncertainty. "Your father, by all accounts a man of considerable pride, dismissed Antoine Desmarais in disgrace. He had, as we now know, fathered a child with a woman whose lineage threatened the family's English standing. A woman your wife, Miss Imogen's mother, had once called a friend." Dalbrook's voice was barely audible. "We were told she left us, that she couldn't endure the shame of it." Poirot's eyes softened. "Your wife did not simply leave, my lord. She was driven away by the weight of deception. Her departure was not cowardice, it was exile. But even exile births a legacy." He turned now to Miss Imogen, who sat upright, pale, the resemblance to her mother more pronounced in the firelight. "Charles Gregory, Charles Desmarais, was your half-brother. He did not seek to usurp your place or blackmail your family. He only wished to know the truth of his origin, and when he found it, he did not demand anything, only understanding." Imogen's voice trembled. "He asked for nothing, and I sent him away." Poirot shook his head. "No, mademoiselle, you did not send him away. Circumstance and fear did." He trusted Mrs. Tilling, a woman who had once cared for him as a child, perhaps without realizing who he truly was. But when the connections grew clearer, when he approached you with the truth, she panicked. She feared scandal would break, the fragile peace this house had clung to. And so she staged his vanishing, never meaning to cause his death. Yet, in that moment of struggle, tragedy came. Hastings cleared his throat. Then the watch, the glove, the uniform. It was all part of the illusion. "Exactly," said Poirot. "A false trail designed to suggest Charles had left of his own volition." But Mrs. Tilling overlooked one thing. Charles was too clever. He left the glove. He buried the journal. He led the path toward the truth, even in death. Poirot moved to the desk and retrieved a final item. The unopened letter, addressed to Antoine Desmarais. "I have not read it," Poirot said, "because its contents are not for me. But it is time someone did." He extended the envelope to Miss Imogen, who took it with trembling hands. "I do not know if I am ready," she whispered. Poirot smiled gently. "One is never ready for truth. One only arrives." Imogen opened the letter slowly. Her lips moved as she read, her brow knitting and then releasing. Tears formed but did not fall. When she looked up, her voice was barely audible. She loved him. My mother. She loved Antoine, but she couldn't stay. She left the letters hidden here, hoping one day he would return. Poirot nodded. And now, through Charles, he did. A silence followed, less tense than before but heavy with reflection. Poirot allowed it, then finally spoke once more. The mystery, mes amis, is solved. But you must ask yourselves what it leaves behind, not only in terms of justice, but in terms of legacy. Charles Desmarais died not in bitterness, but in pursuit of understanding. If he is to rest peacefully, that understanding must be honored. Lady Willoughby stirred at last. I can speak to the press, she offered. Frame it properly. An unfortunate tragedy, rooted in family affairs, long buried. No scandal, no names. Poirot gave a small bow. Your discretion, madame, is appreciated. Reverend Allerton folded his hands. And I shall offer a private service. He may not have been known to us, but he deserves dignity. Poirot smiled, faintly. That, monsieur, is the first kind thing I have heard in this house. As the room slowly emptied, Poirot remained behind with Hastings. You knew from the glove, didn't you? Hastings asked. That it wasn't just about disappearance, but about memory? Poirot nodded. Oui, mon ami. The glove was too carefully placed. It was an invitation, one last clue. Charles was telling us that even a servant's hand holds truth. That class, station, lineage, they are nothing to the mind. And that, Hastings, is what our murderer never understood. Hastings glanced toward the door. Do you think Imogen will recover? Poirot sighed. She has lost something, yes. But she has gained a brother, if only in memory, and she now knows the lie is over. That is a kind of healing. A log in the hearth cracked and fell, scattering a brief flurry of sparks. Poirot looked into the flames, his voice low. There is justice, Hastings, and then there is repair. Tonight, we have done both. Chapter 10. Outcome and Justice. 3 days later, the sun returned to Charnwood House for the first time in over a week. The fog had lifted, leaving behind crisp skies and an atmosphere eerily serene, as though the very estate had exhaled after holding its breath far too long. But the house itself bore the weight of what had passed within its walls. Not in any visible way. There were no broken windows, no bloodstains, no yellow cordons or inquisitive journalists. But in the quietness of its corridors, the softness of footfalls, and the subdued nature of its residents. Mrs. Tilling had been formally charged with involuntary manslaughter and concealment of evidence. The police, once skeptical of Poirot's more continental methods, had been forced to admit that his findings were not only correct, but essential. The body of Charles Desmarais had been recovered from a disused crypt behind the chapel, hidden beneath a broken slab, wrapped in a groundskeeper's tarp and preserved by the cold. His journal, the brooch, the letter, together they formed a truth so complete it was irrefutable. Lord Dalbrook, ever the statesman, had given a discreet statement to the authorities. A young man in my employ met with an unfortunate accident, he said. A personal tragedy, rooted in the distant past. We mourn him. That was all. The matter, in public, was closed. But in private, ripples remained. Miss Imogen, who had once carried herself like someone slightly removed from the world around her, seemed transformed. She had arranged for a modest stone to be placed in the family cemetery, bearing the name Charles Desmarais Gregory, and beneath it a simple epitaph. Truth, once sought, need not hide. She attended the service in silence, wearing no veil, shedding no tears, but Poirot knew the mourning was within. Lady Willoughby left shortly after the funeral, claiming a previous engagement in Vienna. She took with her a portrait painted by Lawrence Dean, the only item she requested from Charnwood House. It was a portrait of the drawing room as it had appeared during that final night, the figures seated in firelight, their expressions blurred and mysterious. Reverend Allerton stayed a few days longer, offering services and counsel to the remaining staff. Poirot watched him closely as he moved through the house, and for once found in the man no trace of affectation. only a sadness for a missed opportunity, for having watched a storm form and done nothing to prevent it. As for Poirot, his departure was characteristically unceremonious. He disliked long goodbyes. Yet before he left, he sought out Hastings one final time. They walked together through the orchard, where the trees were beginning to bud, the chill still lingering in the shade. "I must admit," Hastings said, "this one unsettled me. No grand villain, no calculating killer, just a woman who made a terrible decision in a moment of fear." "Oui," Poirot replied quietly. "The most dangerous crimes, Hastings, are not those committed with hatred, but those born of panic. A single choice, made in haste, out of love or shame, can do more damage than years of plotting." Hastings shook his head. And poor Charles. He was so close to finding out who he was. "He did find out," Poirot said, "and he left a path so others might see it too." They walked in silence for a while until they reached the far edge of the orchard. There, resting against an old oak, was a bench, newly placed, simple in design. Poirot's eyes fell on the small brass plaque affixed to it, for the one who asked the quietest questions. He smiled. "Justice, mon ami," he said at last, "is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is about restoration, giving voice to those who were once invisible, ensuring the forgotten are remembered." Hastings nodded. "Will you miss this place?" Poirot turned, his eyes sweeping across the estate, its symmetrical hedges, its disciplined flower beds, the looming house that had once hidden so many secrets. "No," he said, "but I will remember it." And with that, Hercule Poirot, the man of impeccable order, quiet observation, and relentless logic, stepped into the waiting motor car and was driven away, leaving Charnwood House behind, but not untouched. The truth had been uncovered, and the house would never be the same again.